The Mediterranean world had witnessed countless naval campaigns, but few matched the sheer scale and confidence with which Rome approached this assault. The empire, already feared for its iron discipline and unmatched military machine, believed that crushing one coastal city would be little more than a display of force. To ensure total domination, they dispatched a fleet of approximately 200 warships, quinquiremes, and triremes, whose very presence sent shockwaves across the sea. This was no ordinary show of strength. It was a calculated demonstration of Roman supremacy, meant to intimidate anyone who dared resist their authority. The horizon darkened with sails, oars churned the water into froth, and the synchronized drumbeats that guided their rowers echoed like thunder approaching the shoreline. For the people inside the besieged city, the sight of this enormous fleet was more than alarming. It was suffocating. They understood what 200 Roman ships signified: overwhelming manpower, seasoned marines, siege engineers, and enough resources to keep pressure on the city for months. Rome never sent such a force unless they wanted to make a statement. Every vessel carried trained soldiers who had fought in the Mediterranean's deadliest conflicts. Their commanders were veterans of campaigns from Sicily to Carthage, their confidence steeped in the empire's centuries-old tradition of naval strength. They believed no resistance could withstand the might of Rome assembled in such numbers. As the ships advanced, their formation revealed the precision for which Rome was notorious. Squadrons moved like a single organism, with rows of oars rising and falling in perfect unison. The fleet was arranged to overwhelm the city from multiple angles. Front-line ships pushing forward to initiate ramming runs, while others followed closely behind to deploy boarding parties once the defenses were weakened. Roman marines stood ready, helmets gleaming, shields stacked along the decks, prepared to storm the walls or set the harbor ablaze. From the towers of the city, observers could see the insignias painted on the sails, the bronze-clad rams at the front of the ships, and the unwavering discipline of an empire that had defeated far greater enemies than a single rebellious port. There was no doubt in anyone's mind. Rome came expecting surrender. Their overwhelming fleet was meant not only to conquer, but to intimidate, to force the defenders into abandoning hope before a single arrow was fired. The psychological weight of 200 approaching ships pressed down on the city like a storm cloud. Even the waves seemed to bow beneath the synchronized might of Roman engineering. Yet behind the looming threat of the empire's power, the defenders did not break. While the Romans saw only a small city ripe for conquest, they did not know that inside those walls stood one mind capable of turning the greatest fleet of its era into wreckage scattered across the sea. The defenders of the coastal city faced a terrifying reality. Their enemy was not a small raiding party or a regional navy. They were up against the full maritime might of Rome. Yet what the Romans did not expect was that the city's greatest weapon was not an army, not a fleet, and not a king. It was intellect. Instead of relying on conventional soldiers, the city depended on a single extraordinary mind, someone whose understanding of mathematics, physics, and engineering far surpassed anything the Roman commanders could imagine. While Rome depended on numbers and brute force, the defender relied on geometry, precision, and innovation, turning the very principles of science into instruments of war. Inside the city's workshops, complex designs had been drawn long before the Roman fleet appeared on the horizon. They were not sketches of ordinary catapults or ballistae, but of machines built around perfect calculations, angles, trajectories, leverage, distance. All the variables of battle had been transformed into exact numbers. Even the layout of the city's walls had been studied and turned into part of a larger defensive formula. Each tower, each platform, and each elevation point was chosen intentionally to create overlapping zones of fire. While ordinary generals studied maps and troop formations, he studied arcs, fulcrums, and the mechanical advantage needed to outthink an entire empire. When word arrived that Rome was sending hundreds of ships, panic might have spread among lesser defenders. But within these walls, preparation replaced fear. The engineers and craftsmen working under his guidance constructed devices that seemed impossible machines capable of firing stones with such precision that ships could be struck from distances the Romans believed were safe. Every weapon was carefully calibrated according to mathematical tables. Ropes were measured by ratios, counterweights selected according to exact mass, and even the tension of the torsion engines was calculated to deliver maximum force with minimum error. What others considered guesswork, he turned into science. The most extraordinary part was not just the machines themselves, but the confidence behind them. While the Romans were certain their overwhelming numbers guaranteed victory, the defender understood something they did not. That intelligence, when applied correctly, can multiply power far beyond what sheer manpower ever could. He knew that even without a massive army, he could disrupt Roman formations, disable their ships, and cause chaos by targeting the fleet's most vulnerable points. Instead of preparing for a desperate last stand, he prepared for a demonstration of how knowledge could become a weapon sharper and heavier than any sword. The city's people witnessed first-hand the transformation of their walls. Strange devices appeared on the towers. Long arms of wood and iron, geometric mechanisms, sighting frames, and lever-based constructions that no ordinary soldier could decipher. The Romans believed they were approaching a simple coastal city, unaware that its defenses had been shaped by principles far older and far stronger than imperial ambition. The coming battle would prove that while Rome trusted in steel, discipline, and overwhelming force, the defenders trusted in the one thing Rome could neither predict nor overpower: the brilliance of the human mind. As the Roman fleet advanced confidently toward the city, their commanders believed they were still far beyond the reach of any meaningful resistance. Roman naval doctrine relied on getting in close enough for their marines to board, close enough for their rams to splinter enemy hulls. They expected only arrows or small stones from the city walls, nothing that could truly threaten a well-armored quinquereme at long distance. But the defender had anticipated precisely this arrogance. Long before the first Roman ship entered firing range, the city's newly engineered artillery systems had already been calibrated, loaded, and aligned with mathematical precision. On the towers, crews stood beside enormous catapults and ballistae, each machine positioned according to careful calculations of height, wind, and trajectory. These were not ordinary engines of war. They were extensions of geometry itself, built to exploit every advantage the defenders had. As the Roman front line pushed forward, confident in their safety, a deep wooden groan echoed across the walls. The first projectile was launched, not in a wild arc, but in a perfect parabola that cut through the sky with terrifying accuracy. The stone smashed into the deck of a leading ship, splintering wood, throwing men overboard, and instantly revealing a harsh truth. The Romans were not safe at all. Panic rippled through the first rows of ships. They had been struck from a distance greater than they thought possible. Roman commanders quickly signaled their rowers to adjust course, but before they could regain coherence, a second and third projectile flew, each finding its mark with unnatural precision. These were not random volleys meant to intimidate. They were mathematical solutions executed through machinery. The defenders were not firing blindly. They were solving problems, predicting the movement of ships, and adjusting each shot with an intellect trained for perfection. As the fleet attempted to shift formation, hoping to move out of range, the ballistae joined in. Their long iron bolts tore through sails, pierced hulls, and swept across decks with deadly accuracy. A single bolt could travel flatter and faster than a stone, striking before a Roman marine even realized the weapon had been fired. Ships that tried to turn were caught broadside, presenting larger targets. Every maneuver Rome attempted only seemed to increase their vulnerability. The psychological shock was immense. The Romans had fought countless sieges and believed themselves experts in naval warfare, yet they had never encountered weapons that struck with such accuracy at such distances. They were accustomed to facing defenders who panicked when a fleet approached, but here they met defenders who seemed to welcome long-range combat. For every stroke of a Roman oar, a calculated response awaited. Officers yelled orders to close the gap faster, seeking safety in proximity, but doing so required tightening formation, making them even more susceptible to the defenders' devastating precision. Men ducked behind shields, sailors hesitated at their posts, and commanders exchanged uneasy glances as more ships took damage long before they could threaten the harbor. Rome had underestimated the battlefield. They assumed numbers would dictate the outcome, but the defender had rewritten the rules of war. Long-range catapults and ballistae did not merely slow the Roman advance. They shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility, introducing fear into a fleet that had expected unquestioned dominance from the moment its sails appeared on the horizon. As the Roman ships pushed closer, eager to escape the deadly precision of the long-range engines, they believed that once they reached the walls, the advantage would shift back in their favor. They had faced catapults before. They had weathered volleys of arrows and stones in dozens of campaigns. What they did not anticipate was the presence of devices so unconventional, so ingenious, that they seemed almost unnatural. The defenders had prepared not one line of weapons, but several layers of engineered surprises, each based on principles the Romans neither understood nor respected until it was too late. The first shock came in the form of concentrated sunlight. From a distance, Roman sailors noticed a strange gleam on the towers, as though metal plates or polished surfaces had been arranged for some unknown purpose. But when the fleet drifted into range, the purpose became clear with horrifying speed. Mirrors, arranged in carefully aligned arrays, caught the Mediterranean sun and focused it into narrow beams directed at the Roman sails. At first, the crews ignored it, just a shimmer, a bright flicker. Then the flicker grew hotter, unbearable, almost alive. Sails made of thick cloth began to smoke. Rowers felt their skin burn as beams touched their arms and backs. Within moments, patches of cloth ignited, turning rigging into fire traps. Panic erupted across decks as men scrambled to douse small explosions of flame that spread faster than expected. Commanders shouted for water buckets, but the damage was already done. The fleet's front line was thrown into chaos before it had even reached striking distance. Rome had no tactic for this. Naval battles were fought with wood, muscle, and iron, not with the sun itself turned into a weapon. Ships slowed as men struggled to save burning sails, breaking the tight formation needed for a coordinated attack. Some vessels drifted into the paths of others, creating collisions and snarled rigging. The defenders had succeeded in disrupting the rigid discipline upon which Roman naval power depended. But the second wave of defense was even more terrifying. As the Roman ships, scorched and scattered, finally closed in near the city walls, they expected arrows and boiling oil. Instead, they met the crushing power of mechanical arms, massive iron claws hidden behind battlements, each controlled through a system of levers and pulleys that magnified strength beyond anything a human could deliver alone. When a Roman vessel came near, the defenders triggered these machines. Great iron hooks dropped outward, grabbed the front of a ship, and lifted it violently upward. Sailors screamed as the ship tilted at impossible angles, water rushing to one side, men tumbling into the sea. With a final pull, the machine released the ship, sending it crashing back down with such force that its hull split on impact. Some ships were flipped outright, capsizing like toys in the hands of an invisible giant. The Romans had never encountered anything like these claws. Their naval tactics relied on approaching as a unified wall of hulls and soldiers. But now every ship that dared come too near risked being plucked from the sea and smashed to pieces. Fear replaced discipline, captains refused to close in, rowers hesitated, unsure whether obeying orders meant rowing directly into a death trap. Chaos spread from deck to deck. Flames continued to burn. Crashed ships blocked retreat. Leviathan, like claws, reached out again and again. The Romans had come expecting a siege. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a storm of inventions created by a mind far more dangerous than any army they had ever faced. The Roman commanders had entered the battle believing victory was inevitable. They had numbers on their side, discipline on their side, experience on their side. Every lesson they had learned across decades of Mediterranean warfare told them that a small, isolated city could never stand against the might of 200 Roman ships. But as the battle unfolded, it became painfully clear that they were not fighting an ordinary opponent. They were fighting intellect, pure, calculated intellect, and nothing in the Roman military handbook prepared them for that. The longer the battle continued, the more the Romans realized they were being maneuvered not through strength, but through thought. Every move they made had been predicted. Every formation had a counter waiting for it. Their confidence, normally as solid as the iron rams on the fronts of their ships, began to fracture. The defenders were not simply reacting to Roman aggression. They were shaping the battlefield, bending it around principles of geometry and engineering, turning even the sea itself into a weapon. Where the Romans expected resistance, they encountered traps. Where they expected weakness, they found precision. With each destroyed ship, the morale of the Roman fleet eroded. They had come believing that overwhelming force would crush resistance instantly, but instead they found themselves losing vessels before even reaching striking distance. Their disciplined formations fell apart, disrupted not by enemy soldiers, but by the devastating efficiency of the machines designed by a single brilliant mind. It wasn't just the accuracy of the catapults or the terrifying claws that shook them. It was the realization that every part of the defender's strategy was deliberate, intelligent, and perfectly adapted to counter Rome's strengths. As more ships caught fire from concentrated sunlight, others were torn apart by precisely aimed projectiles, and still more were dragged under by mechanical claws. The legend of the battle began to take shape. Sailors whispered in fear. Officers exchanged glances of disbelief, not because they feared the defenders' numbers, they were few, but because they feared the mind controlling the battlefield. Rome was accustomed to fighting armies whose tactics followed predictable patterns. This opponent followed logic that transcended ordinary warfare. Each machine, each angle, each defensive mechanism had been crafted with mathematical elegance. They weren't just fighting resistance, they were fighting inevitability. Many Roman ships tried to retreat, but the confusion was so intense that escape became nearly impossible. Burning vessels collided with others trying to reverse course. Some ships capsized while attempting desperate maneuvers. The sea, once a symbol of Roman dominance, turned into a graveyard of broken hulls and drifting debris. What stunned the Romans the most was how little manpower the defenders needed. A handful of operators controlling carefully engineered devices inflicted more damage than entire legions could have achieved. To the Roman soldiers, it felt less like a battle and more like a demonstration, a lesson in what the mind can achieve when it refuses to surrender. By the time the surviving Roman ships finally limped away, the message had been carved into their memories with greater force than any sword. Overwhelming numbers mean nothing when faced with superior intellect. On that day, geometry defeated an empire, knowledge overcame power, and the defenders proved that brilliance, when wielded with courage, can stand alone against the forces of the greatest superpower of the ancient world. And so, as the last Roman ships limped back across the horizon, the smoke rising behind them told a story no empire could bury. 200 ships had come to break a small, defiant city. Yet it was not steel, not fire, not armies that decided the outcome. It was the power of a mind that refused to accept inevitability. The defenders had no legions, no grand fleet, no reinforcements waiting beyond the waves. What they had was understanding of angles, of light, of force, of the natural laws that govern every battlefield. In a world where empires believed strength was measured only by numbers and conquest, this battle proved otherwise. Geometry became their shield, engineering became their sword, and knowledge became their most devastating weapon. The Roman fleet arrived expecting surrender. Instead, they found themselves facing a force they could not intimidate, could not predict, and could not overpower. Their pride shattered, their discipline broke. Their ships burned, cracked, and sank beneath the strategies of a genius whose mind reshaped the rules of war. On that day, the Mediterranean witnessed more than a victory. It witnessed a revelation that brilliance, sharpened by courage, can stand alone against the greatest empire of its age and win. Thank you, Notes documentary style. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most extraordinary defenses, where knowledge triumphed over power and innovation rewrote the fate of empires. Thank you to the viewers who continue to support stories of ancient strategy, forgotten heroes, and the moments that shaped our world. And thank you to every mind that refuses to stop questioning, calculating, and imagining, because history is made not only by those who fight, but by those who think.